January 17th, 1943. Somewhere over the frozen plains of occupied Europe, the air at 20,000 feet is not cold, it is hostile. It claws through the gaps in flight suits, turns breath to ice crystals, and makes every rivet of the B-17 flying fortress feel like frozen iron against bare skin. Inside the cramped bombardier's compartment, Lieutenant James Harrigan lies flat on his stomach in the plexiglass nose of the aircraft, his world reduced to crosshairs, calculations, and the cylindrical device mounted before him like an altar. Below, through breaks in the cloud cover, the earth appears as a patchwork quilt of snow-dusted fields and villages, serene and indifferent to the machinery of war thundering above. The engines drone in mechanical harmony, a sound that has become the heartbeat of this aerial crusade. Harrigan's gloved fingers rest on the controls of the Norden Bombsight, an instrument so classified that its very existence is protected by armed guards, classified manuals, and sworn oaths of secrecy. In 8 minutes, he will attempt what no bombardier in history has been trained to do with such precision: place 500-pound explosives into a target no larger than a factory building from an altitude where men appear as specks and roads as threads. The Germans below do not yet know he is coming, but they will. They will know by the exactness of the destruction, by the surgical precision of American bombing doctrine, and by the terrifying realization that the sky itself has become a weapon of mathematics. This is not merely about dropping bombs. This is about a machine, an American machine, that promised to change the very nature of strategic warfare. A device so accurate, its designers claimed, that it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. A boast that seemed like propaganda, like the kind of exaggeration born from desperate optimism in a world at war. But the Norden bombsight was different. It was real. It was precise, and it represented something the Axis powers could not replicate, could not steal, and could not counter. The marriage of American ingenuity, industrial might, and an unwavering belief that technology could deliver not just victory, but moral clarity in how that victory was won. While German bombardiers relied on rudimentary optics and guesswork, while the Luftwaffe crews carpet-bombed cities in the hope that something vital would burn, American crews were trained on an instrument that transformed bombing from an act of terror into a science of angles, velocities, wind drift, and gravitational arcs. The Germans had nothing close, not in concept, not in execution, and certainly not in the philosophy that birthed it. To understand the Norden bombsight is to understand America in 1943, a nation that believed problems could be solved, that precision was a virtue, and that the application of reason and resources could bend even the chaos of war toward order. But to understand its impact, one must first understand what came before it, and why the men who flew with it believed they held in their hands not just a tool of war, but a promise of something better.
The world did not begin the Second World War with precision. In the years before the Norden, bombing was an exercise in approximation and hope. Pilots in the First World War had dropped grenades by hand from open cockpits, aiming by instinct and prayer. By the 1930s, bombers had grown larger, faster, and deadlier. But the fundamental problem remained. How do you hit a specific target from an altitude high enough to avoid ground fire? The answer, for most nations, was simple and brutal. You didn't. You bombed areas. You leveled neighborhoods. You set cities ablaze and called it strategic necessity. The Luftwaffe's blitz over London, the RAF's firebombing of Hamburg, these were not precision operations. They were campaigns of attrition and terror. predicated on the belief that enough destruction would break the enemy's will. Accuracy was secondary. Volume was everything.
But America, late to enter the war and possessed of both industrial capacity and a peculiar national optimism, sought a different path. The United States Army Air Corps, later the Army Air Forces, developed a doctrine called precision daylight bombing. The theory was seductive in its clarity. Instead of destroying entire cities, American bombers would strike specific military and industrial targets: factories, rail yards, oil refineries, submarine pens, crippling the enemy's ability to wage war while minimizing civilian casualties. This was not merely tactical preference, it was moral theater. America wanted to win the war, yes, but it also wanted to win it cleanly, to demonstrate that democratic nations fought with precision and discipline, not the indiscriminate savagery of fascist regimes. And to execute this doctrine, they needed a tool that could deliver on the promise. Enter Carl Norden, a Dutch-born engineer who emigrated to America and became obsessed with the problem of bombing accuracy. Norden was a perfectionist, a man who believed that engineering could impose order on the chaos of combat. In the 1920s, working in near secrecy with funding from the U.S. Navy, he began developing an optical analog computer, a device that could calculate the trajectory of a falling bomb in real time, accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and the Earth's rotation. It was an audacious goal. The variables were staggering. A bomb released from 4 miles up does not fall straight down. It follows a parabolic arc influenced by gravity, air resistance, temperature, and the forward motion of the aircraft. A bombardier had to factor in all of these elements in the seconds before release, and any error in calculation would send the bomb hundreds of feet off target. Norden's solution was a mechanical marvel, a gyroscopic bombsight that stabilized itself against the pitch and yaw of the aircraft, linked to an automatic pilot that could fly the plane more steadily than any human hand during the final bombing run. The bombardier would input data, altitude, airspeed, wind, and the sight would compute the precise moment to release. In theory, it could place a bomb within 100 feet of its target from 20,000 feet. In practice, it became the most closely guarded secret of the American war effort. By 1943, the Norden bombsight was standard equipment on every B-17 and B-24 heavy bomber in the European theater. Its mechanisms were so classified that bombardiers were required to destroy the device with thermite grenades if their aircraft was in danger of capture. Training on the Norden took months, and crews were drilled endlessly on its operation until the calculations became second nature. The device itself weighed 50 pounds, a complex assemblage of gears, mirrors, lenses, and gyroscopes that required constant calibration and care. It was fragile, it was temperamental, and it was, according to the men who used it, the closest thing to magic they had ever seen. But the Germans did not have magic. They had the Luftwaffe 7, a series of optical bomb sights developed by Carl Zeiss and used throughout the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was competent, better than most Allied bomb sights of the early war, but it was fundamentally limited. It required the bombardier to manually track the target and estimate release points based on experience and instinct. There was no automatic pilot integration, no real-time computation of wind drift or velocity changes. German crews compensated with lower-altitude bombing runs,
which increased accuracy but also exposed them to devastating anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe's doctrine reflected this limitation. They bombed at night, they bombed in mass formations, and they bombed with the understanding that precision was aspirational, not operational. For all their engineering prowess, for all their technical innovation in tanks and rockets and jet aircraft, the Germans never developed a bombsight that approached the Norden's capabilities. They knew it existed. Intelligence reports and captured equipment confirmed it, but replicating it was another matter. The Norden required not just technical knowledge, but a manufacturing base capable of producing precision
instruments at scale, and by 1943, Germany's industrial infrastructure was already under strain. The Japanese faced even greater deficits. Their bomb sites were crude by comparison, often little more than modified versions of British designs from the 1930s. Japanese bombing doctrine emphasized torpedo bombing and dive bombing for naval warfare, where precision was achieved through proximity, not altitude. The idea of bombing from 4 miles up with surgical accuracy was foreign to their tactical thinking. When Japanese pilots encountered American formations over the Pacific, they were often baffled by the altitude at which B-29 superfortresses operated, flying at heights where Japanese interceptors struggled for oxygen and maneuverability. The Americans bombed from the stratosphere, untouchable and relentless, and they did so with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But confidence, the German soldiers would soon learn, was not arrogance when it was backed by results. In the winter of 1943, Luftwaffe officers began collecting after-action reports from ground units stationed near bomb targets. What they read was unsettling. American bombing runs were hitting bridges, not the rivers beside them. They were destroying specific factory buildings while leaving adjacent structures intact. Rail yards were being cratered with such precision that repairs took weeks instead of days. This was not the indiscriminate carpet bombing the Germans had inflicted on London and Coventry. This was something new, something that suggested a level of technical sophistication they could not match. German engineers examined wreckage from downed B-17s, hoping to recover an intact Norden bomb site. Occasionally they succeeded, only to find a molten ruin of thermite-scorched metal and glass. The Americans, it seemed, would rather destroy their own equipment than allow it to be studied. This only deepened the mystique. Propaganda photographs of captured Norden sites were circulated in German intelligence circles, but without the training manuals, without the maintenance protocols, without the intricate knowledge of how to calibrate and operate the device, they were useless. It was as if the Germans had been handed a watch and told to understand time itself. The psychological impact was profound. German bomber crews, already suffering catastrophic losses in the face of Allied air superiority, began to internalize a grim realization. They were outmatched not just in numbers, but in technology. The Americans could bomb with precision because they had built a machine that made precision possible. The Luftwaffe could only respond with tactics born of desperation, flying lower, bombing at night, accepting higher casualties in exchange for marginal accuracy. There was no equivalent to the Norden in the German arsenal, and by 1944, there would be no time to develop one. The industrial war had become a war of instruments, and in that contest, America's advantage was overwhelming. Lieutenant Harrigan, lying in the nose of his B-17, did not think about industrial advantages or strategic doctrine. He thought about the crosshairs, the wind correction dial, the steady altitude hold, and the seconds ticking down to the release point. The Norden bomb sight hummed softly beneath his hands, its gyroscope spinning with mechanical precision. Through the eyepiece, the target, a locomotive repair facility outside Schweinfurt, slid into view. Harrigan adjusted for wind drift, a crosswind out of the west at 15 knots. The sight compensated, the crosshairs shifting slightly.
The automatic pilot kept the aircraft steady, steadier than any human hand could manage. Flak burst around them, black flowers of shrapnel blooming in the thin air, but Harrigan did not flinch. He had learned to trust the machine. In training, instructors had repeated the mantra until it became doctrine. The Norden will do the thinking. You just feed it the data. And he did. Altitude, airspeed, drift, temperature. The sight calculated the parabolic arc, the gravitational drop, the forward motion of the aircraft. And then, at the
Precise moment, determined by gears and gyroscopes and the accumulated genius of American engineering, the bombs released. Harrigan did not see the impact. By the time the bombs fell 4 miles and 23 seconds, the B-17 had banked away, rejoining the formation. But the reconnaissance photographs taken the next day would show the locomotive shed destroyed, the adjacent buildings intact, the rail lines severed with surgical precision. Not a pickle barrel, perhaps, but close enough to prove the point. The pickle barrel, of course, was always a metaphor. No bombardier in combat ever attempted to hit a literal pickle barrel. The phrase was marketing, a piece of wartime salesmanship designed to sell the American public on the idea that their bombers were instruments of precision, not engines of indiscriminate death. But, like all effective metaphors, it contained a kernel of truth. Under ideal conditions, no wind, clear visibility, steady altitude, and no enemy fire, the Norden bombsight could indeed achieve astonishing accuracy. Test runs in the Nevada desert, where targets were painted on dry lake beds and bombardiers had unlimited attempts, produced results that clustered within a 100-foot radius from 20,000 feet. This was unprecedented. This was, by the standards of 1940s technology, miraculous. But combat was not the Nevada desert. Combat introduced variables the Norden could not fully account for. Clouds obscuring the target, flak forcing evasive maneuvers, smoke and dust from previous bombing runs, mechanical failures, human error. In practice, the circular error probable, the radius within which half of all bombs would fall, was closer to 1,000 feet under combat conditions, still remarkable, still far superior to anything the Axis could achieve, but not a pickle barrel. Yet the myth persisted, and it persisted because it served a purpose. It reassured Americans that their sons were fighting a clean war, a war of precision and moral clarity. It distinguished American bombing from the terror campaigns of the Luftwaffe and the RAF's area bombing. And it reinforced the narrative that American technology, American ingenuity, was not just winning the war, but doing so in a way that reflected democratic values. Whether or not the Norden could actually hit a pickle barrel was less important than what the claim represented: control, precision, and the belief that even in war there were rules, standards, and limits. The Germans understood this, and it infuriated them, not because the claim was false, but because they could not match it. German engineers were not incompetent. They had developed jet engines, guided missiles, and infrared night vision devices. But the Norden bombsight required a specific confluence of factors that Germany lacked by 1943: abundant resources, uninterrupted production, and the luxury of time to refine and perfect. The Norden had been in development since the 1920s. It had undergone dozens of iterations, each improving on the last. Carl Norden himself had spent years obsessively calibrating gyroscopes, testing lenses, and refining the mechanical algorithms that made the sight work. This was not a crash program born of wartime desperation. This was the product of 2 decades of patient, methodical engineering, funded by a nation wealthy enough to invest in long-term research without immediate payoff. Germany, by contrast, was fighting a war on multiple fronts, its resources stretched thin, its industrial base under constant bombardment. There was no time to develop a competitor to the Norden. There was barely time to produce the weapons they already had. And so, the gap widened. American bombers flew higher, bombed more accurately, and returned home in greater numbers. German defenders adapted,
improved flak tactics, faster interceptors, coordinated fighter sweeps, but they were fighting an uphill battle against an enemy that could strike from altitudes where oxygen was scarce and cold was lethal. The Norden bombsight, more than any single weapon, symbolized the
against 39,807 German. And in the final year of the war, as Germany's industrial base crumbled under relentless bombing, the United States still produced 46,001 aircraft, while Germany's output fell to 7,540. Over the course of the war from 1940 to 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,317 military aircraft. Germany produced 119,307. The Americans had built more than 2.5 times as many planes. And this was not because American aircraft were simpler or inferior. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a technological marvel, bristling with machine guns, equipped with advanced bomb sights, capable of carrying tons of bombs across hundreds of miles. The P-51 Mustang was arguably the finest fighter aircraft of the war, combining range, speed, and firepower in a package that German pilots learned to fear. These were not crude weapons hastily thrown together. They were sophisticated machines produced with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Consider the B-24 Liberator, the bomber that Willow Run was built to produce. It was a complex aircraft, requiring hundreds of thousands of individual parts, miles of wiring, tens of thousands of rivets. At the beginning of the war, it took months to build a single B-24. But by 1944, Willow Run was producing one every 63 minutes. Workers arrived at the factory to find that the plane they had been assembling the previous day was already gone, flown away by a crew who would take it to Europe, and a new one had taken its place on the line. The sheer scale of production was so vast that it altered the geography of the factory. Willow Run was so long, over 3,000 feet, that managers initially planned to install moving sidewalks to transport workers from one end to the other. The building consumed materials at a rate that strained the entire Midwest. Thousands of tons of aluminum, rubber, glass, steel, all flowing into the factory like rivers feeding an ocean. This was the reality that German planners had not anticipated. They had assumed that American industry, for all its size, was geared toward producing consumer goods, cars, refrigerators, radios, and could not easily be converted to military production. They assumed that the American workforce, softened by years of prosperity and decadence, would lack the discipline to match German productivity. They assumed that the chaos of democratic decision-making would prevent the United States from mobilizing effectively. Every assumption was wrong. At the heart of this industrial miracle was a simple but profound truth. The United States had more of everything. More raw materials, more factory space, more workers, more engineers, more capital. But abundance alone does not explain the disparity. The Soviet Union also had vast resources, yet it could not match American aircraft production. Britain had a skilled workforce and a highly developed industrial base, yet its output paled beside America's. What set the United States apart was not merely the quantity of resources, but the efficiency with which those resources were organized and deployed. This efficiency was not the product of central planning in the Soviet sense, nor was it the result of anarchic free market competition. It was something in between, a partnership between government and industry in which the government set goals and provided funding, while private companies competed to meet those goals in the most effective way possible. The system was messy and sometimes corrupt. Cost overruns were common, and some companies profited enormously from the war. But it worked because it harnessed the energy and ingenuity of thousands of individual actors, each trying to solve a piece of the larger puzzle. The government's role was crucial.
The War Production Board, established in 1942, had the authority to allocate resources, prioritize contracts, and settle disputes between competing claimants. It ensured that factories producing aircraft had priority access to
industrial and technological disparity between the United States and the Axis powers. It was not just that America had more planes or more bombs. It was that America had better instruments, better training, and a manufacturing base capable of producing precision devices by the thousands. The Germans could build a few experimental wonders, a jet fighter here, a V-2 rocket there, but they could not mass-produce them. America could, and did. By the end of the war, over 50,000 Norden bombsights had been manufactured, equipping every heavy bomber in the Allied arsenal. 50,000 instruments of precision, each one a testament to the belief that technology could impose order on chaos. But technology, as the American crews learned, was never enough on its own. The Norden bombsight was only as good as the man operating it, and bombardier training was grueling. Candidates spent months in ground school learning the mathematics of ballistics, the physics of wind drift, and the intricacies of the Norden's mechanical systems. They practiced on simulators, wooden mock-ups that mimicked the cramped nose compartments of B-17s and B-24s. They flew training missions over the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, dropping dummy bombs on targets painted in concentric circles, their accuracy measured and graded. Anything less than 80% within the target radius was considered failure. The washout rate was high. Not every man had the temperament for it, the patience to lie on his stomach in a freezing plexiglass bubble while flak exploded around him, the discipline to trust the machine even when instinct screamed to take evasive action, the precision to input data correctly under stress. Those who succeeded became a kind of priesthood, guardians of the device that could, in theory, hit a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. And they carried that burden into combat. The Norden was not a fail-safe. It could not compensate for bad intelligence, for targets obscured by smoke, for sudden changes in wind velocity. It could not account for the human cost, the bombardiers who were killed by flak before they could release, the navigators who miscalculated and led formations over the wrong target, the pilots who broke formation under fire and disrupted the bombing run. The promise of precision was real, but so were the limits. And yet, despite those limits, the Norden represented something the Axis could not replicate. A systematic, industrialized approach to bombing that treated war as a problem to be solved rather than a chaos to be endured. German soldiers on the ground learned to recognize the sound, the deep, distant drone of American bomber formations, flying so high they were often invisible from the ground. Then the whistle of falling bombs, a sound that began as a faint shriek and grew into a roar. And then the impact, precise, devastating, surgical. Bridges collapsed at their midpoint, not at the approaches. Factory roofs caved in, but surrounding homes stood intact. Rail lines were severed at junctions, forcing logistical nightmares. This was not the terror bombing of the Blitz. This was methodical dismantling. And it bred a different kind of fear. The British had bombed to break morale. The Americans bombed to break capability. The difference was subtle but profound, and it seeped into the consciousness of the German military. They were not being terrorized. They were being deconstructed. By 1944, the Norden bombsight had become a symbol, not just of American air power, but of American certainty. It represented the conviction that war could be fought with precision,
that technology could mitigate brutality, that industrial capacity could substitute for ideology. The Germans had fought with fervor, with the belief in blitzkrieg and the superiority of the Aryan will. The Japanese had fought with fanaticism, with the code of Bushido and the readiness to die for the emperor. But America fought with instruments, with machines that calculated trajectories, with factories that produced those machines by the thousands, with a logistical network that delivered them to the front lines and kept them
Operational. The Norden was not romantic. It was not glorious. It was functional, practical, and devastatingly effective. And in its functionality, it embodied a philosophy that problems have solutions, that chaos can be ordered, and that the application of reason and resources will, eventually, prevail. This was the transformation that German soldiers experienced, not a sudden epiphany, but a slow erosion of confidence. They had expected the Americans to bomb like the British, to lay waste to cities in the night and call it victory. Instead, the Americans bombed in daylight, from impossible altitudes, with a precision that seemed almost surgical. It suggested a level of control, of technological mastery, that was deeply unsettling. The Luftwaffe had pioneered strategic bombing, had perfected the art of the dive bomber and the terror raid. But they had never developed the tools to bomb with the kind of accuracy the Americans claimed. And now, in 1944, with German cities burning and supply lines severed, the cost of that gap was becoming clear. Japanese commanders faced a similar reckoning. When B-29 superfortresses began operating over the home islands in late 1944, they flew at altitudes where Japanese interceptors could barely reach them. The B-29s were equipped with Norden sights, refined, improved versions that incorporated lessons learned from the European theater. They bombed precision targets, aircraft factories, shipyards, munitions plants. Later, the doctrine would shift and the B-29s would drop incendiaries, turning Tokyo into an inferno. But in the beginning, the doctrine was precision, and the Norden made it possible. Japanese flak batteries fired blindly into the sky, hoping to hit something, anything. Japanese pilots climbed to oxygen-starved altitudes and watched as American bombers released their payloads with mechanical indifference. There was no Japanese equivalent to the Norden. There was no Japanese answer to the combination of altitude, firepower, and precision that the B-29s represented. There was only the grinding realization that the war had entered a phase where technology, not courage, would determine the outcome. The symbolic object in this story is the crosshair. Not the bombs themselves, not the aircraft, but the crosshair, the simple intersection of lines in the Norden's eyepiece that represented the convergence of calculation, technology, and intent. Every bombardier stared at those crosshairs, watched as the target slid into view, adjusted for wind and drift, and waited for the moment of release. The crosshair was where mathematics became action, where theory became destruction. It was impersonal, clinical, and utterly precise. And it recurred in the accounts of bombardiers with a near religious significance. When the crosshairs lined up, you knew, one veteran recalled. You knew the machine had done its job. You knew the bombs would fall where they were supposed to. The crosshair represented control in an environment defined by chaos. It was the one constant, the one element the bombardier could trust when flak was bursting and fighters were attacking and the aircraft was shaking from turbulence. The crosshair did not lie. It did not waver. It was the distillation of American precision into a single visual reference. And for the Germans who survived American bombing runs, the crosshair became something else,
a symbol of inevitability. They could not see it, of course. It existed only in the bombardier's eyepiece, but they understood its implications. When an American formation appeared overhead, flying in perfect boxes at 20,000 feet, the defenders knew that somewhere in one of those bombers, a man was lying prone, staring at crosshairs, adjusting dials, and preparing to release. They knew that the bombs, when they fell, would fall with purpose. Not randomly, not carelessly, but with the cold, calculated precision of a machine designed for that singular purpose. It was a different kind of terror, not the visceral fear of firebombing, but the intellectual dread of knowing that destruction was coming and there was nothing they could do to prevent it.
The Norden bombsight, in the end, was not invincible. It did not end the war on its own. It did not prevent civilian casualties or guarantee moral purity in the American bombing campaign. Bombs dropped with the Norden still missed. Targets were still obscured. Errors were still made. But what the Norden did do, and did effectively, was provide the American military with a tool that matched its doctrinal aspirations. It allowed the United States to bomb with a level of precision that no other nation could achieve, and in doing so, it reinforced the narrative that American power was not just overwhelming, but also controlled. The Pickle barrel was a myth, but myths, when they inspire confidence and demoralize enemies, have a power all their own. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. American and British bombers had reduced German industrial capacity to rubble. Rail networks were shattered. Oil refineries stood silent. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was grounded for lack of fuel and pilots. And in the wreckage of factories and cities, German engineers occasionally found fragments of Norden bombsights salvaged from crashed B-17s, too damaged to be of use, but preserved as curiosities. They were displayed in technical schools after the war, studied by students who marveled at the complexity of the gyroscopes and the elegance of the mechanical algorithms. This, an instructor would say, pointing to the device, is why we lost, not because of the bomb itself, but because of what the sight represented. A nation that could produce 50,000 of these instruments, that could train tens of thousands of bombardiers to use them, that could sustain a strategic bombing campaign across 2 theaters of war, such a nation could not be defeated by fervor or ideology alone. It required resources, infrastructure, and a commitment to precision that Germany, by 1943, could no longer muster. The Japanese experience was similar, but more compressed. The B-29 raids over Japan escalated from precision strikes to area firebombing, and then to the ultimate expression of aerial warfare, atomic bombs. The Norden bombsight that guided the Enola Gay over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was the same model that had been dropping conventional bombs over Europe for 3 years. The crew trained on it for months, practicing on mock targets until they could release within seconds of the calculated impact point. On the morning of the mission, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee lay in the nose of the B-29, staring through the Norden's eyepiece at the T-shaped AOE bridge, the aiming point for the world's first combat atomic bomb. The crosshairs aligned, the data was input, the machine calculated, and at exactly the predetermined altitude and position, the bomb released. It detonated 43 seconds later, less than 200 meters from the aiming point. Precision, even in apocalypse. The Norden did not make the atomic bomb more terrible. The bomb's horror was inherent, regardless of how it was delivered. But the fact that it could be delivered with such accuracy, that a single bomb could be placed within meters of a designated point from 6 miles up, underscored the technological chasm between the United States and its enemies.
The Japanese had no equivalent capability, no device that could calculate trajectories with such precision, no training program that could produce bombardiers capable of such accuracy, no industrial base that could sustain the production of such instruments. The Norden bombsight, in the end, was one piece of a much larger machine, the American war effort, but it was an emblematic piece. It distilled the American approach to war, systematic, technological, and executed with a confidence born from abundance. And it was abundance more than precision that defined the American experience of the war. The Germans and Japanese fought with scarcity of fuel, of raw materials, of time. They rationed everything, hoarded resources, and made desperate gambles.
Because desperation was the only option left, America fought with surplus steel, surplus oil, surplus manpower, surplus food. The factories that produced Norden bombsights also produced jeeps, tanks, aircraft carriers, and penicillin. The farms that fed American soldiers also exported wheat to Britain and meat to the Soviet Union. The training programs that produced bombardiers also produced navigators, pilots, engineers, and medics. This was not just a war of attrition, it was a war of capacity, and America's capacity was so vast, it seemed almost limitless. The Norden bombsight was a product of that abundance, an expensive, complex, precision instrument that required years to develop and millions to produce, and yet was manufactured by the tens of thousands because America could afford to do so. German soldiers captured in the final months of the war often spoke of this in their interrogations, not the fear of death, not the despair of defeat, but the sheer incomprehension of American material superiority. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe technician, described examining a crashed B-17 and being astonished not by the damage, but by the quality of the components. Everything was manufactured to such a high standard, he said. The wiring, the instruments, the hydraulics. We were repairing our aircraft with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. They were flying machines that looked like they had just come off the factory floor. The Norden bombsight epitomized this disparity. It was not just a weapon, it was a statement. We can afford to build this, we can afford to train men to use it, and we can afford to lose them and build more. You cannot. This realization that the war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories, was the transformation that Axis soldiers experienced. They had been told they were fighting for survival, for honor, for the preservation of their nations and ideologies, and perhaps they were, but they were also fighting against a system of production and logistics that they could not match. The Norden bombsight was one small component of that system, but it was a component that symbolized the whole. It represented the convergence of science, industry, and national will into a single instrument of war. And when that instrument worked, when the crosshairs aligned and the bombs fell precisely where they were intended, it demonstrated not just technical skill, but a kind of industrial inevitability. In the epilogue of this story, there is a poetic truth that transcends the mechanics of bombsights and the statistics of bombing runs. The Norden, for all its precision, was still a tool of destruction. It could not change the fundamental brutality of war, could not eliminate collateral damage, could not restore the lives lost or the cities burned. But it represented an ideal, a belief that even in the midst of total war, there were better and worse ways to fight, that precision was preferable to indiscrimination, that technology could be a civilizing force, even in the uncivilized act of dropping bombs. This was, perhaps, a naive belief. The strategic bombing campaign did not spare civilians. Cities were still destroyed, families still lost, innocents still died.
But the Norden embodied the aspiration, even if the reality fell short. It was a machine built on the premise that America could win the war without becoming what it was fighting against. And in the decades after the war, when the Norden bombsight was declassified and its mechanisms revealed to the public, it became a symbol of American ingenuity in a different way, not as a weapon, but as an artifact. A reminder of a time when the application of scientific principles and industrial capacity seemed capable of solving any problem, even the problem of war. The bombsight was donated to museums, displayed alongside P-51 Mustangs and Sherman tanks, examined by schoolchildren who marveled at the complexity of its gears and gyroscopes. And in those museums, the narrative was always the same. This is the device that won the war in the air. This is the machine that could hit a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. This is American precision.
The German soldiers who survived the war and returned home carried with them a different memory. They remembered the sound of American bombers overhead, the precision of the strikes, the sense that they were fighting an enemy that had not just more weapons, but better ones. They remembered the Norden not by name. Most never knew what it was called, but by its effects. The bridges that fell, the factories that burned, the rail lines that were severed with surgical accuracy. They remembered, and they told their children and grandchildren that the Americans had fought with machines that seemed almost unfair. They bombed from so high we couldn't shoot them down, one veteran recalled in an oral history recorded in the 1970s. And they hit exactly what they were aiming for, every time. It was like fighting an enemy who had already won. And perhaps that is the larger truth the Norden bombsight reveals, that wars are won not just by courage or ideology, but by the capacity to build, to organize, to produce, and to deploy resources at a scale that overwhelms the enemy. The Germans had courage. The Japanese had fanaticism. But America had factories, engineers, and an industrial base that could turn precision instruments into mass-produced tools of war. The Norden was one product of that system, but it was emblematic of the whole. It was a machine born from abundance, refined through patience, and deployed with a confidence that came from knowing that if one was lost, 10 more could be built to replace it. In the end, the pickle barrel was never just about accuracy. It was about the promise that technology, wielded by a free and prosperous nation, could impose order on the chaos of war. That promise was never fully realized. War remains chaotic, brutal, and imprecise no matter the tools used. But the Norden bombsight represented the attempt, the belief that precision was possible and worth striving for. And for the men who flew with it, who trusted it, and who returned home to tell their stories, it was enough. The crosshairs aligned. The bombs fell, and somewhere, far below, the enemy learned that the sky itself had become a weapon, not of terror, but of calculation, not of chaos, but of order. And that, more than any single bomb or any single mission, was the transformation the Norden wrought. It changed how wars were fought, and how nations understood the power of precision in the hands of those who could afford to build it.